Picture this. You're walking through the grimy streets of Victorian London in 1870, and you witness something that makes your stomach turn. A group of children, some no older than 6, are being herded through the gates of what looks like a fortress, made of cold stone and iron bars. These aren't criminals being led to prison. These are orphans being delivered to what society called a workhouse. But as you're about to discover, these innocent children would have been better off behind actual prison walls than in the institutions supposedly designed to care for them. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of childhood suffering that history tried to bury, if you're fascinated by the dark truths hidden in our past, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It amazes me that we're uncovering these historical horrors together from all corners of the world, connected by our shared need to understand how society could have failed so catastrophically. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of Victorian hardship. This is the story of how an entire generation of vulnerable children became trapped in a system so brutal, so dehumanizing, that actual convicted criminals received better treatment, better food, and more dignity than innocent orphans whose only crime was being born into poverty. The workhouse system wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was deliberately designed to be harsh. The architects of Victorian social policy believed that making life unbearable for the poor would somehow motivate them to magically escape poverty. But when you're 6 years old and your parents are dead, motivation doesn't put food in your belly or warmth in your bones. Let me paint you a picture of what awaited these children. The moment an orphan crossed the threshold of a workhouse, their childhood effectively ended. They were stripped of their clothes, their possessions, and most importantly, their names. Each child received a number, and from that moment forward, they ceased to exist as individuals. They became units in a machine designed to extract labor while providing the absolute minimum needed to keep them alive. The daily routine began before dawn with the clanging of bells that echoed through dormitories packed with dozens of beds crammed so close together that children could barely move between them. These weren't comfortable beds. They were wooden planks with straw mattresses so thin you could feel every board beneath. The blankets, if you could call them that, were rough wool that scratched and irritated the skin, providing barely enough warmth to prevent death from exposure. But here's where it gets truly horrifying. Breakfast consisted of a bowl of watery gruel so thin you could see through it, accompanied by a chunk of bread so hard it could break teeth. This wasn't just poor quality food, it was deliberately insufficient. The portions were calculated to keep children weak and compliant, operating on the edge of starvation. A typical prison meal during the same period included meat, vegetables, and proper bread. Criminals ate better than orphans. After this meager breakfast, the real nightmare began. Children as young as 5 were assigned to work details that would challenge grown adults. Some were sent to the oakum room where they spent 12 hours a day picking apart old rope until their fingers bled. The oakum, loose fiber created by unraveling rope, was used for caulking ships, and the work was so repetitive and painful that it drove many children to the edge of madness. Others were assigned to the bone mill where they crushed animal bones into powder for fertilizer. The stench was overwhelming, the dust got into their lungs, and the constant grinding motion left their arms and backs in permanent agony. But the overseers didn't care about pain or exhaustion. If a child slowed down or complained, they faced punishment that makes your blood run cold. The punishment cells were underground chambers, barely large enough for a child to lie down. No windows, no light, no heat. Children were thrown into these holes for infractions as minor as speaking during work time or failing to finish their impossible quotas. They were left in complete darkness with nothing but bread and water, sometimes for days at a time. Many emerged broken in spirit, never to speak again. Meanwhile, actual prisoners in Victorian jails were guaranteed exercise time in outdoor courtyards, access to chaplains, and the right to receive visitors. They had legal protections that ensured minimum standards of treatment. Orphans had none of these rights because they weren't considered criminals. They were considered burdens on society who should be grateful for any care at all. The medical treatment in workhouses was virtually non-existent. Children suffering from diseases were often left to die rather than receive proper care because treating them cost money. Sick children were separated from the healthy ones, but this separation usually meant being abandoned in infirmary rooms with no medical attention whatsoever. disease spread rapidly through the overcrowded dormitories, and death was so common that workhouses maintained their own cemeteries filled with unmarked graves. But perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect was the complete isolation from human affection. Children were forbidden from forming friendships, showing emotion, or expressing any kind of personality. They were beaten for laughing, punished for crying, and brutalized for showing any sign of the natural curiosity and playfulness that defines childhood. The goal was to create obedient workers, not healthy human beings. The clothing provided was deliberately humiliating. Rough, ill-fitting uniforms that marked them as workhouse children wherever they went. The fabric was so coarse it caused constant skin irritation, and the shoes were wooden clogs that rubbed blisters on their feet. But these weren't just practical considerations. They were designed to strip away dignity and mark these children as society's rejects. Education, when it existed at all, consisted of learning just enough reading and arithmetic to perform basic labor tasks. There were no books for pleasure, no games, no music, no art, nothing that might spark joy or creativity. The philosophy was that these children were destined for lives of manual labor, so anything beyond basic skills was considered wasteful. Compare this to the prison system of the same era, where inmates could learn trades, receive religious instruction, and even access libraries. Prisoners were being prepared for eventual reintegration into society, while orphans were being systematically broken down to accept lives of permanent servitude. The psychological damage was intentional and profound. Children entered these institutions with hope and emerged as hollow shells of human beings. They were taught that they were worthless, that they deserved nothing better, and that their suffering was justified because they were burdens on decent society. This wasn't rehabilitation, it was systematic destruction of the human spirit. What makes this even more heartbreaking is that many of these children had living relatives who simply couldn't afford to care for them. Poverty wasn't a moral failing, but Victorian society treated it as such. Families were torn apart not by death or abandonment, but by an economic system that refused to provide adequate support for struggling parents. The workhouse masters, the officials who ran these institutions, were often sadistic individuals who seemed to take pleasure in the suffering of children. They were paid based on how little they spent per child, creating a financial incentive to provide the absolute minimum care possible. The cheaper they could keep each child alive, the more profit they could pocket. Nighttime brought no relief from the horror. Children were locked in dormitories with no access to toilets, forced to soil themselves or face punishment for leaving their beds. The smell was overwhelming, the crying was constant, and sleep was nearly impossible on the hard wooden planks they called beds. But the true evil of the system wasn't just the physical suffering, it was how it convinced these children that they deserved this treatment. They were told repeatedly that they were lucky to receive any care at all, that they should be grateful for the cruelty inflicted upon them. This psychological manipulation ensured that even those who survived would carry the trauma for the rest of their lives. The children who managed to survive their time in these institutions emerged into the world as damaged human beings, ill-equipped for normal life and carrying scars that would never heal. But survival itself was a lottery that most children lost. The mortality rate in workhouses was staggering. In some institutions, more than half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Their small bodies simply unable to withstand the combination of malnutrition, disease, overwork, and systematic abuse. Those who did make it to their teenage years faced an equally grim reality. At 14 or 15, they were expelled from the workhouse with no skills, no connections, and no understanding of how to function in normal society. They had been so thoroughly conditioned to accept abuse that many couldn't recognize when they were being exploited in the outside world. Former workhouse children became easy targets for unscrupulous employers who knew they would accept starvation wages and brutal working conditions without complaint. The girls faced particular horrors. Many were sold into domestic service where they endured sexual abuse from their employers, or worse, were forced into prostitution because they had no other means of survival. They had been taught that their bodies weren't their own, that they existed solely to serve others, making them vulnerable to every form of exploitation imaginable. The boys often ended up in dangerous industrial jobs where their shortened lifespans meant they rarely lived to see 30. The bone dust they had inhaled during their workhouse years left many with lung diseases that slowly suffocated them, Others bore permanent physical deformities from the repetitive labor they had performed as children, their spines twisted and their hands gnarled from years of unnatural work. But perhaps most tragically, these survivors were incapable of forming normal relationships or raising healthy families. They had never experienced love, kindness, or basic human compassion. When they had children of their own, they often repeated the cycle of abuse because cruelty was the only form of child rearing they had ever witnessed. The records that survive paint a picture so horrific that many historians initially dismissed them as exaggerations. But the evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Government inspectors who visited these institutions often fled in horror, unable to complete their assessments. Medical professionals who examined workhouse children documented malnutrition so severe that it stunted both physical and mental development permanently. Meanwhile, prisoners in the same era were beginning to benefit from prison reform movements that recognized their basic humanity. Reformers argued successfully that even criminals deserved humane treatment and opportunities for rehabilitation. But orphans, innocent children whose only crime was being born into poverty, were considered unworthy of such compassion. The workhouse system persisted because it served the economic interests of Victorian society. These institutions provided a steady stream of broken, desperate workers who would accept any conditions, rather than return to the hell they had escaped. It was a system designed to create a permanent underclass of human beings who had been so thoroughly dehumanized that they would never demand better treatment. What's most haunting about this chapter of history is how efficiently it was hidden from public view. The workhouses were deliberately built on the outskirts of towns, away from the eyes of respectable citizens who might have been disturbed by what they witnessed. The few journalists or social reformers who tried to expose the truth were dismissed as troublemakers or blocked from access entirely. The children themselves were silenced by trauma and conditioning. Even decades later, survivors rarely spoke about their experiences because they had been taught that their suffering was justified and that no one would believe or care about their stories. This conspiracy of silence allowed the abuse to continue for generations. Today, we look back at the Victorian era and often romanticize it as a time of moral values and social order. But the treatment of orphaned children reveals the ugly truth beneath that polished surface. A society so obsessed with economic efficiency and social control that it was willing to sacrifice its most vulnerable members on the altar of profit. The workhouse system finally began to crumble in the early 20th century, not because society suddenly developed compassion for orphaned children, but because the economic model became unsustainable. By then, countless innocent lives had been destroyed in service of an ideology that valued money over human dignity. The legacy of this systematic abuse echoes through generations. The descendants of workhouse survivors often carry genetic markers of trauma passed down through DNA that remembers starvation and terror. The broken families, the cycles of abuse, the inability to trust or love, all of this stemmed from a society's decision that orphan children deserved less compassion than convicted criminals. This isn't just a historical curiosity or a reminder of how far we've come. It's a warning about what happens when we allow economic systems to override basic human decency, when we decide that some people are more deserving of care and compassion than others. The Victorian workhouse system was the logical conclusion of a society that valued profit over people, efficiency over empathy. These forgotten children deserve to be remembered not as statistics or symbols, but as individual human beings who suffered unimaginably for the crime of being born into circumstances beyond their control. Their stories remind us that civilization is measured not by how we treat the powerful and privileged, but by how we care for the most vulnerable among us. In remembering their suffering, we honor their memory and commit ourselves to ensuring that such systematic cruelty never again masquerades as charity or social policy. Because in the end, a society that treats its orphaned children worse than its criminals has lost its soul entirely.